We have Monica Gale from Trinity in Dublin. We're switching authors and switching genres. She's going to talk to us. Well, the title of her talk is Quare faciam nescio sed sentio fieri, Affect and Self-Scrutiny in Catullus. Monica, go on ahead.
Thanks very much, Adrian. So I don't have a PowerPoint. There is a handout, which I hope everyone can see.
It's in the chat, yes.
Thanks, Adrian. So the impetus for this paper came, in fact, from two quite different directions. And I'm particularly grateful to Adrian and Quare for helping me through the conference call for papers to see how they might be connected. And still more indebted to them, of course, for offering me this forum, for airing what is very much work in progress. This is all very new material to me. And I'd be particularly delighted, therefore, to hear your thoughts and criticisms in the discussion. The first part of my paper, then, arises out of recent work by myself and others on Catullus and Hellenistic philosophy. Or perhaps it would be more accurate to say a certain anti-philosophical bias in Catullus's poetry. In a forthcoming book chapter, I suggest that the relatively numerous echoes of the contemporary Epicurean philosopher and epigrammatist Philodemus that punctuate Catullus's collection point to an antagonistic relationship between the two poets, rather than, for instance, one of mutual admiration, like that expressed by Catullus for a number of his Roman contemporaries. I link this in turn to what I see as a submerged hostility towards Epicureanism, which can be traced in Catullus's poetry. Like his contemporary Cicero, Catullus draws on the cliches of anti-Epicurean polemic to portray both Philodemus and his patron Calpurnius Piso as greedy, lecherous, and self-indulgent hedonists. James Uden, I'm not quite sure how to pronounce it, Uden's discussion of the Ignatius poems, which is shortly to appear in Antiquity, I think nicely complements these conclusions. So Uden argues that Catullus travesties, or to use his word, banalizes Ignatius's putative Epicureanism by misconstruing his smile, in Epicurean terms, the external sign of an inner serenity or ataraxia, as a mere social gaffe. What could be read as imperviousness to the distressing emotions provoked by funerary ritual, or by the emotive power of forensic oratory, is maliciously depicted by Catullus as insensitivity to social nuance. In short, as a lack of the urbanitas, the stylishness, the smartness, which Catullus so prizes. Similarly, poem 37, where Ignatius features again as one of Lesbia's lovers in the Salax Taberna or Randy Inn, reduces the Epicurean values of fellowship or contubernium and dispassionate enjoyment of sexual and other pleasures to a kind of mindless groupthink on the one hand, and a brutish, indiscriminate sexuality, that's Uden's phrase, on the other. Now, for Uden, Catullus's banalization of Epicureanism is in essence a literary and social power play, by which the poet seeks to show how his own personal value system is separate from and superior to the superficially similar Epicurean ideals of friendship, withdrawal from public life, and untrammeled enjoyment of sexual and culinary pleasures. By, quote, representing his invective targets as part of a discursive field over which he has control, end quote, that of taste rather than philosophical belief or political conviction, Catullus gains symbolic power and ascendancy over them. My third witness, Leah O'Hearn, in a recent article in Classical Quarterly, considers a somewhat different way in which Catullus appropriates and manipulates the tropes of philosophical discourse. She scrutinizes Catullus's use of the adjective beatus, blessed, happy, which can be applied equally to philosophical eudaimonia and to wealth of a more mundane and material kind. Now, financial acquisitiveness is attributed by Catullus to many of his invective targets, Mamurra, Julius Caesar, Pompey, and Furius, amongst others, but is also displayed by the poem's speaker himself on a number of occasions. Ahern seeks to resolve this apparent conflict by drawing a sharp distinction between poet and persona, Catullus and Catullus, if you like. The former shows that the pursuit of material goods is deluded, that true eudaimonia lies elsewhere, in part by using his own persona as a kind of anti-exemplum. I tend to wonder whether this is rather too tidy a solution to what seems to me a genuine fracture in Catullus's code of values as it's represented across the corpus. This is something I don't really have time to discuss today, but I'm happy to come back to it in the discussion if anyone would like to. In my view, both Ahern and Uden are clearly right to suggest that the philosophical topoi and ideas current in the intellectual debates of the day inform Catullus's representation of self and others to a significant extent. Uden's insight that the poet banalizes philosophical ideas is also, I think, a persuasive and important one. But I want to go somewhat further in suggesting that Catullus, in various ways, interrogates the very notion of cognitive understanding, so fundamental to all branches of ancient philosophy, and ultimately finds it wanting. The promise of philosophy, especially Hellenistic philosophy, to cure human ills is shown to be inadequate in the face of experience, as Catullus represents it. Now, crucial in this regard is the intellectualist bias, so fundamental to ancient philosophy in general. From the Socratic, no one does wrong willingly, to Epicurean and Stoic accounts of the passions as essentially failures of understanding, Greek and Roman thinkers typically assert an intimate connection between eudaimonia, flourishing on the one hand, and a clear and accurate knowledge, in particular accurate knowledge of the self, on the other. For the Epicureans, there is for sure a certain paradox in the role of reason as a corrective to the pernicious influence of false opinion. Our natural instinct, according to Epicurus, like that of irrational animals, is to pursue pleasure and shun pain. But Epicurean logismos, reasoning or calculation, is necessary in order to countermand the pressure of social and cultural conditioning, which inevitably contaminates these primary instincts. So that for Epicurus, we need reason in order to restore us to what are in fact our instinctive behaviours. Stoicism advances a still more rigidly cognitivist model of emotion, according to which an initial bite or pre-emotion, propatheia is the technical term, requires the individual to give or withhold assent in order to develop into a fully fledged emotion. Put differently, distress, for example, can be defined with Cicero, this is passage 1 on the handout, as a fresh opinion that an evil is present, in which one thinks it right to lower and contract the mind. Desire as an opinion that a good is in prospect, which it would be expedient to have present here and now. Now, related, I think, to the role of knowledge or understanding in the control of the emotions is the importance of self-knowledge in both Stoicism and Epicureanism. Assigned a central place already by Socrates, the Delphic gnosis auton is developed by the Stoics in particular into a meditative practice, well described by Catherine Edwards in an article on the list of references at the end of the handout, dealing primarily with Seneca's letters. Seneca then exhorts his correspondent Lucilius, and through him the reader in general, to examine and scrutinise himself in order to ensure continued progress towards wisdom. This is best achieved, Seneca suggests, through systematic review of one's daily activities, a model of the care of the self that Seneca ascribes in the De Ira, handout passage 2, to the Augustan age philosopher Sextius. Sextius used to do this. At the end of the day, when he'd gone to his nightly rest, he would interrogate his own mind. What fault of yours did you correct today? What vice did you resist? In what respect are you better? Anger will die down and be more moderate if it knows it must appear before the judge every day. I make use of this privilege and every day put myself on trial. When the lamp is taken away and my wife has fallen silent, I scrutinise my whole day and review what I've done and what I've said. I hide nothing from myself, pass over nothing. Now, Seneca's account of self-scrutiny as meditative practice can in fact already be paralleled in Horace's satires. Here, the homely wisdom, which Horace claims to derive from his father, has strong similarities with the Stoic practice as described by Seneca. This is handout passage 3. Nor, when I've withdrawn to bed or to the seclusion of a colonnade, do I fail myself. This is more virtuous. By doing this, I shall live better. In this way, I shall make a good impression on my friends. A certain person did not behave well. Did I once inadvertently do something of the kind to him? Probably, as Emily Gowers suggests in her commentary on the passage, citing an anecdote related to Plato by Plutarch, we should see a broadly philosophical colouring here. The practice of self-scrutiny is evidently not limited to the imperial age Stoics, with whom it's most commonly associated. In fact, Epicureanism too, at least in the version presented by Lucretius, implicitly advocates careful scrutiny of our own behaviour and motivation, as well as that of others. Most explicitly at the beginning of Book 3, and this is the long passage at handout 4, I won't read it out, but it's there for you to look at. Lucretius argues that many of our most self-destructive behaviours are ultimately attributable to the fear of death. Even those who lay claim to a superficial enlightenment can be unmasked in extreme circumstances, such as exile. Eripitor persona manet res, writes Lucretius. The mask is stripped away, the facts remain. The theory of unconscious motivation implicit in these lines points, I think, to the need for careful self-examination. Are we genuinely pursuing the path of pleasure and well-being? Or have we been led astray by the false values imposed by our culture? Tasting from the lips of another, as Lucretius, I think, very memorably puts it in another metaphor at the end of Book 5. Now, at first sight, these twin emphases on self-scrutiny and self-knowledge have close parallels in Catullus, who seems, on the evidence of several poems, to set a high value on self-awareness. The most familiar example is poem 22, handout 5, on the poetaster Cephanus, who's thoroughly delighted with his own dismal efforts to what the speaker represents as his own bemusement. Yet, in an uncharacteristically conciliatory gesture, Catullus concludes in the passage that I've put on the handout that we're all unaware of our own faults. The same guy, Cephanus, is clumsier than the clumsy countryside the moment he turns his hand to poetry. Yet he's never as happy as when he's writing a poem. He's so pleased with himself, admires himself so much. Well, I guess we all make the same mistake, and there's no one you couldn't see as a bit of a Cephanus in some way or other. We all have our own failings, but we can't see the half of the knapsack that's on our own back. Now, Catullus is used in these concluding lines of the poem of the Aesopic fable of the double knapsack, according to which other people's faults are in the front pouch of the bag where we can see them, but our own in the pouch behind our back, we can't, involves, I think, a truly Socratic irony. The speaker may not know what his own faults are, but at least he knows that he has faults, and in this respect is more self-aware than the hapless Cephanus. The apparent generosity of sentiment turns out to be misleading. Ultimately, the self-knowledge to which Catullus lays claim only deepens and strengthens the contrast with his victim. Other poems in the collection are more merciless still in their attacks on the self-deluding, and I've got some references under number 5 on the handout. Mamurra attempts to write poetry in poem 105. The muses chase him out with pitchforks. Ameana in poem 41 asks Catullus for money. She should try looking in the mirror occasionally, Catullus suggests. Both characters, we might say, lack awareness of their own limitations. Mamurra of his literary skills, Ameana of the defects, as Catullus represents it, of her own appearance. Others again are blind to what's really going on around them. The complacent husband of poem 17, who's likened to a log lying in a ditch and is hardly aware even of his own existence. Or Lesbia's own husband, who's fatuously delighted by her abuse of Catullus, not realising that, as all devotees of rom-coms are of course well aware, abuse is the surest sign of erotic passion. But what happens, I want to ask, when Catullus turns the spotlight on Lesbia herself and her relationship with him? Among the best known and most admired of all Catullus's poems are the sequence of epigrams in which he obsessively dissects and analyses his feelings for her and hers for him. What went wrong in their relationship? How could she not reciprocate the unparalleled devotion he offered her? Since D.O. Ross's important study of the language of the epigrams, it's been widely accepted that Catullus draws on a terminology of Roman elite social relations in these poems. Catullus's vaunted officium, duty, and benevolentia, goodwill, bear a strong resemblance to the terms in which relationships between male amici are typically conceptualized, for example, by Cicero, both in the De Officiis and in his correspondence. But perhaps equally salient here is the theme of deception and knowledge, blindness and insight. In poem 72, handout passage 6, Catullus writes, "Now I know you, nunc te cognovi, I know what you're really like," contrasting here present and past emotions, past devotion, present disillusion. Here, I think we can usefully compare the Remedia Amoris offered by Cicero in Book 4 of the Tusculans, and especially by Lucretius at the end of Book 4 of the De Rerum Natura. Cicero emphasizes throughout this section of the Tusculans that all emotions are judicio suscepta and voluntaria, taken on consciously and voluntarily. That is, they're cognitive and voluntary experiences. Accordingly, love can be cured merely by demonstrating to the lover that the object of his desire is worthless and commonplace, and that there are plenty of other fish in the sea, no more nor less desirable than the beloved. This is handout passage 7. I'll read the translation again. Here then is the cure that should be applied to the person thus affected. One should make clear to him the nature of the thing he desires, how slight, how contemptible, how completely worthless it is, and how easily one can get it somewhere else or in some other way, or do without it altogether. Finally, one should prove to the person what we say about every emotion, that is experienced only through one's own opinions and judgment and is voluntary. Similarly, the key remedium in Lucretius's medical kit is clear sight. Lovers are blind and confused. Caecus and incertus are recurring words in the finale to Book 4. But with a little effort, one can obtain a clear view of the object of desire. And again, I won't read it out, but I've put the key passage on the handout at number 8. True, Lucretius admits it's harder to escape the snares of love once caught. Now, mutare plagas in amore ne jaciamur non ita difficile est. But recovery is nevertheless assured, provided that one does not blind oneself to the beloved's faults. But for Catullus, this is insufficient. If we go back to handout passage 6, the realization that Lesbia is vilis and levis, very similar terms to those used by Cicero, only makes him burn for her all the more. Tellingly, I think, the somewhat prosaic Lucretian phrase difficile est, highlighted on the handout, recurs in the culminating poem of Catullus's epigram sequence, poem 76. Along with 85, handout 9, the distich Odiet Amo, quoted in the title of my paper, this longer epigram suggests that the speaker's project of self-examination has been an unambiguous failure. Both poems effectively contrast emotion, we should say affect, with cognitive understanding. Why do I do this? The imaginary interlocutor asks Catullus in the first line of 85. I don't know, but I feel it. Nescio sed sentio, comes the response. Poem 76, I've put the key sections of it on the handout at number 10, unpacks these conflicting modes of experience somewhat more fully. So Catullus begins here, provocatively enough, by invoking the philosophical commonplace that virtuous action is its own reward. He's shown the appropriate benevolentia, goodwill, in his relationship with Lesbia, and she has failed to reciprocate. Again, I'll read my translation. If there's any pleasure for a man in recalling past good deeds when he believes that he's acted dutifully and not broken a sacred trust or abused the divine power of the gods to deceive people in any pact, many joys await you, Catullus, in the long years to come from this unrequited love. For whatever good people can do in word or deed, this you have said and done, all of which is lost, entrusted as it was to an ungrateful mind. So why do you keep on torturing yourself? Why not be strong, pull back from the brink, and stop being wretched, since the gods are opposed? Is it hard to lay aside a long-held love all at once? It is hard, but you must do it somehow. This is your one chance of health. This you must overcome. Do it, whether it's possible or not. Now, it seems to me that there's a crucial turning point in the last lines I quoted there, 13 to 15, with the Lucretian phrase difficile est. Contrary to what the philosophers say, reason for Catullus is not enough. Lesbia has broken the rules. She's failed to uphold her side of the contract. So Catullus, on his own estimation, should just stop torturing himself. But the second half of the poem introduces a different model of emotion as a psychophysical pathology, a bundle of feelings that cannot be controlled or meaningfully analysed. In language reminiscent of Sappho, he characterises his state of being as a deadly paralysis, which has plunged him into depression incompatible with the experience of Laetitia. He no longer wants anything of Lesbia, just to stop feeling the way he does. But the sober reasoning of the first part of the poem cannot achieve this end. In fact, his pietas has brought him anything but pleasure, and recognition of what he constructs as Lesbia's faults cannot extricate him from the snare of amour, to use the Lucretian metaphor. Understanding and rationalisation, he suggests, are of no use at all. All Catullus can do, in a very un-Epicurean move in particular, is call on the gods for rescue. In the poem's closing line, and perhaps if we choose to read them that way, the very last words of the Lesbia narrative. Gods, look on me in my misery, and if I've led a pure life, cut out this deadly plague which, creeping deep within my body like a paralysis, has expelled all happiness from my heart. Well, I've argued that Catullus ultimately draws a sharp distinction in his epigrams between affect and cognition, emotion and understanding, in striking divergence from contemporary philosophical thought, which insisted on the cognitive basis of the emotions. In the last part of my paper, I want to turn to a related issue, that of the affective relationship between Catullus and his reader. It's here that I come to the second strand in the backstory to my paper, which I mentioned at the outset. Now, I have to confess at this point to having sort of intermittently felt over the years a certain dissatisfaction with the very important work that Marilyn Skinner, William Fitzgerald, David Ray and others have published on Catullus. Though I much admire all of these scholars, whose work has indeed deeply informed my own reading of Catullus, something I couldn't quite put my finger on bothered me about their approach. Reading for this conference prompted me to wonder whether Ricoeur's phrase, the hermeneutics of suspicion, might be helpful in analysing this discomfort on my part. What all three critics, I think, share with much recent scholarship on ancient literature in general is the attempt to uncover something else behind or beneath the textual surface, be it the poet's complicity with the hierarchies of gender and power that structure his patriarchal society, or the writer's manipulative control over the reading process itself. Moreover, as Rita Felsky puts it in a discussion which I found particularly illuminating, such critique always has an adversarial edge. To engage in critique, she continues, is to grapple with the oversights, omissions, contradictions, insufficiencies or evasions in the object one is analysing, end quote. In writing this paper then, I found myself pondering in response the possibility of taking more seriously the model of reading put forward by Catullus himself, a model which is nothing if not affective. The infamous poem 16, and I'm afraid I forgot to put this on the handout, but you're probably all familiar with it. This is Pedicabo et Irumabo. Suggests that Catullus conceptualizes the impact of his work on the reader as one of emotional or even physical arousal. Poetry, he asserts, has wit and charm if it's a little decadent and risque and can stir an itch. What he means by this is, I think, further elaborated in poems 35 and 50. Where the connection is again made between the experience of reading poetry and that of sexual desire or even falling in love. In poem 35, fellow poet Caecilius's girl has fallen in love with him in consequence of reading his unfinished work. His poem has made her fall in love with him. In 50, Catullus himself displays all the symptoms of erotic desire in the wake of an afternoon spent improvising verse with Licinius Calvus. Now, William Fitzgerald, in a brilliant analysis of what he calls the erotics of poetry, interprets this sexualization of the reading process in terms of power relations between writer and reader. The poet, he suggests, manipulates us through a teasing game of giving and withholding, and so maintains the position of control, which is inevitably threatened by readerly autonomy. But I want to suggest a different way of thinking about Catullus's characterization of the experience of reading as a vicarious sharing of or participation in emotions and other affective states. One thing I think that happens to us as we read Catullus's poetry is that we as readers feel the pain of rejection, the excitement of reunion with close friends, even the self-satisfaction of the witty put-down. Attending to the affective responses invited by the text doesn't, I think, necessarily entail a return to the naive identification with Catullus, or the Catullan speaker, that Fitzgerald attributes in the final chapter of his book to what he calls the sentimental narratives of the past. As he comprehensively shows, more recent writers who have bonded with Catullus have often done so on the ground of a shared misogyny. But I want to ask in closing whether our modern distaste for certain elements in the ideological matrix of Catullus's poetry need necessarily hinder an emotive engagement with the text on our part. In this respect, I still find useful Wayne Booth's now deeply unfashionable and in some respects, of course, very dated study, The Rhetoric of Fiction, first published in 1961. In discussing the text construction of an implied reader, Booth notes that, quote, the divorce between my ordinary self and the selves I'm willing to become, that is in the reading process, is not complete. Now, for Booth, resistance to or failure to accept the role of implied reader results in an unsatisfactory reading experience. Of course, more recently, reading against the grain, refusal, that is, to accept the role assigned to us by the text, has become common and indeed normative practice, at least in academic circles, though I often wonder to what extent this normative practice extends to readers outside the academy. But I wonder whether Booth's observation might still prove serviceable, even within academic circles. It seems to me that when we read, we do, in fact, or at least may, strive to occupy the position of the implied reader, without, however, suspending our own beliefs and value system. Indeed, an important part of the experience of reading non-contemporary and even some contemporary literature arises from the interplay or even the clash between the two. Thus, an affective response to Catullus's, or indeed any poetry, need not be naive or uncritical. I hope that I'm not merely stating the obvious in suggesting that ideologically inflected critique of Catullus's construction of gender roles and sexual norms can thus coexist happily, productively, with a more traditional mode of analysis, which seeks to describe the poem's emotive impact on readers, and importantly, to show how that impact is engineered by the text. Catullus, I've argued, insists against the philosophers that emotions don't go away just because one understands them, even if one understands that they're misconceived or unfounded. I suggest that something analogous may be said of our own reading of the poems. An affective response may still be possible and appropriate, even in the light of the patriarchal and misogynistic assumptions exposed by the suspicious readings of the last 30 to 40 years. If I may close by quoting Felsky once more, current interest in the ethos, aesthetics, and ethics of reading is long overdue. Such an orientation by no means rules out attention to the socio-political resonances of texts and their interpretations. It is, however, no longer willing to subordinate such attention to the seductive but sterile dichotomy of the critical versus the uncritical. Thank you.